All right. Well, here we are again. We're still in Memphis.
Yep.
This is our second day. Yesterday we capped off the Divine Conspiracy, and that was great. I think it was a good capstone, a good ending, a good turn of the page to what we're working on now. While we've been finishing up the Divine Conspiracy, you've been doing a lot of work on our mission statement. And our mission statement, for those of you that hear us say it when we talk about it or read it in the description, is to recapture the Christian imagination. And you've been working a lot on what exactly we mean when we say that, because I wrote the little paragraph that goes as our mission statement with the podcast probably 6 months ago.
Yeah.
6 or 7 months ago, trying to hammer down what we were doing. And you told me one day, you were like, we say that, but what do we mean? So we've talked about it a bit. And then you started writing about that idea, which you're going to be publishing some of those in different ways, hopefully here in the near future. But we figured we would sit and talk through some of exactly what we mean when we say recapturing the Christian imagination, to give us and everybody listening a better idea of what we're up to here, what we're doing. So do you want to talk about that stuff that you've been writing, the way you've been thinking about this?
Yeah. So we say that we're here to recapture the Christian imagination. First and foremost, that means that the Christian imagination has in some sense been lost. And at some point, we're probably going to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, if you listen to our talks through the Divine Conspiracy, you can hear a little bit about, especially in what we shot yesterday, talking about recapping kind of our whole experience, our top 5 things we're drawing from that. I think we referenced a lot of things that we would see as a loss of the Christian imagination. So in an attempt to recapture it, I started thinking about really what does it mean to recapture? So, I mean, you have to know what is lost. And when you know what is lost, then, how do you work towards gaining it back again?
Yeah.
So, when you outlined that mission, I thought it was really captivating, but for neither of us was it really explicit what we meant. We knew that it was right. It was accurate to what we were trying to do, but like intuitively. But we weren't really sure all of the implications of that. And so I spent some time doing some research and some writing, trying to hammer out what it is that means. And that's going to become episodes and some other things in the future. But here we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean. And I've seen this recapturing of the Christian imagination operating in what we do and in who we are in 2 senses. It means recapturing a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world. And so there are also two modes of transformation, 2 things that you can engage in to transform these 2 aspects of who we are. And so when I talk about ways of seeing, I mean the perspectives that we take, the outlook that we bring to all of the situations that we engage in our lives. And the way that I think we best transform that is through what I'm broadly calling literature. Now, that doesn't mean you're reading Charles Dickens all the time. That can also mean what you watch on TV, the YouTube videos or Instagram or TikTok content that you engage in. That can mean the video games you play. Yes, the books you read. It's the narratives that you consistently engage in your life, and they transform the outlook of your life, the outlook that you bring to all of the situations you engage in your life. And so that's what I mean by way of seeing, and how I think literature transforms our way of seeing. And then there's the way of being piece. The way of being is not just the way you show up to the perspectives that you take on things. It's the way that you behave. It's the way that you naturally, I mean, we talked with the divine conspiracy, becoming the kind of person who naturally fulfills the law. That has to do with your being. What is it that you naturally do, you naturally engage in? That's what flows out of your being. And so we as Christians, we need to be concerned with our being existing in a way that is authentically Christian. And I think the church has done, as we talked about through the divine conspiracy, a poor job of cultivating that in its congregants. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that I think that is because we have a bad liturgy. And so the liturgy, not just the liturgy on Sunday mornings, whatever church context you're involved in, they have a liturgy. They have a pattern that they operate within. We'll talk a bit about this in more detail in a little bit, but they have a pattern that they operate within. And your life has a liturgy. You wake up in the morning, you go through the same morning routine, you go to work or school, you operate the same way in those contexts pretty consistently. You hang out with your friends, you go back home, you make dinner, you go to bed, you go to the gym, all of these things, the rote, repeated things we do in our life, they operate on our being and help transform who we are and how we show up in the world. And so I think the church liturgy, but also the liturgies of our life, mm-hmm. of which the church liturgy should be the foremost, the primary.
Right.
They operate on us to transform the way we exist, our being in the world. And so I think you and I, at least on the podcast, we primarily engage ways of seeing.
Yeah.
But in our personal lives, when we go to church or when we talk about, interpersonally, the way we exist in the world, we also do a decent bit of talking about our ways of being and directing those to proper ends.
Yeah, and these ways of being, we talked a lot about that in 8, 9, and 10 in the Divine Conspiracy.
Yes.
That was much of those conversations we were having was about. I mean, that's why we use the examples of Shia LaBeouf mm-hmm. and Penn Jillette and Shia again, and talked a lot about, Willard speaks of transforming the automatic responses that we have, the things that are conditioned in us.
Yeah.
That you can transform those and make them something else. And then in the first bit of, in things like Gospels of Sin Management or Flying Upside Down or Our God-Bathed World, those chapters had a lot to do with mm-hmm. ways of seeing. So even in the content that we've been covering lately, that has shown through. And then in stuff like what I've been doing with the Genesis series, and you're going to be doing some of that as well, that's all ways of seeing.
Yeah.
That's what I've been arguing, is that the assumptions, the way, the glasses, the lenses through which many people, I'd say many American Christians impose or peer through onto the text with, is the wrong way of seeing it. It's a way that is modernist and materialist and creates very little room for literary form and function and trope. Mm-hmm. And that's much of what I've been trying to do, in better or worse ways through this series on Genesis, exposing the people that have helped me get a different way of seeing it, especially with Marty's ideas about the poem of the creation account being a chiasm, mm-hmm. being the shape in which you can fold it in on itself and the patterns repeat each other. This is what I did we talked about this last night off camera, but in the Judah and Tamar and it comparison that I made. I was trying to elucidate, and I told you this kind of jokingly. I was ahead of my own time.
Mm-hmm.
I had this intuitive sense that these two things mirrored each other in ways that are important, and in the fact that they use the same trope. The author is using words and pictures and images to describe certain characters or scenes on purpose. This is what when Heiser talks about reading the prose narrative in the Old Testament like it's fiction.
Yeah.
What he means is the author's doing the word choices, the even the pattern of the stories, the pattern of either the narrative of like a character like Abraham and himself, or the fact that the pattern of Genesis 38 and 39 is you have Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery and go lie to their father, and then the very next story is Judah and Tamar.
Yeah.
And the question is, why are these stories next to each other? There's some reason that these are placed beside one another in the same way that not as explicitly in it, but in the same way that King uses Beverly's. You first meet her as an adult, and you see later how her childhood has affected her decisions as an adult, which, as I said in the video, it's part of the whole thing of the monster. It reappears every 27 years. It comes back. The things from before that you didn't deal with, that weren't transformed, come back and haunt you. And the way that Beverly, as a child, suffers at the hands of her father, and in the same way suffers at the hands of her husband years later. And she's described in ways in that scene with her husband that are meant to tip you off that this is the thing this is the monster she has to deal with.
Yeah.
It's on purpose. It's not King doesn't choose these phrases and these scenes, these images he uses for that scene arbitrarily. It's anything but arbitrary. And the same thing in Genesis. There is this reason that the authors, the compilers, whoever they were, placed 38 and 39 next to one another. It's not arbitrary.
Yeah.
And do you recognize whose these are? The phrase that word that gets repeated is not arbitrary.
Yeah. Well, that word that gets repeated to Jacob by Judah and his brothers after selling Joseph into slavery is the same words that get spoken to Judah about his injustice of Tamar, and it calls forth a repentance in him, and that's why these stories are placed next to each other. And the thing, so a couple of things, just thoughts in response to what you just said. First of all, when I outlined these ways of seeing and ways of being, it was trying to, like you said, that you'd kind of unknowingly done this. It was my attempt of making what we've been doing explicit and describing, like trying to put words to what we've been doing. And so that is a really good example of how we've been working on ways of seeing for a really long time. But the other thing is, I mean, this is your phrase that you keep saying, why would it be any other way? The Bible, of course, uses literary tropes in order to communicate things. I was listening yesterday to the first chapter of Planet Narnia by Michael Ward, and in it he talks about how Lewis was the kind of person who thought that good literature hides things within it that you get to mine out of the text because and that enriches your experience of the text and brings forth new wisdom to you every time you engage it. And the thing that the point that we're trying to make with this way of seeing is that literature in general helps us see the world differently, and that the Bible specifically is the lens through which we as Christians are supposed to see the world. And just like Lewis is insistent that literature is a lens through which we look to see the world, and just like Lewis is insistent that things hidden in literature help us and shape us and form us, so too should we also bring those same assumptions to the Bible, because the Bible is good literature. It's special literature, yes. I do believe that it is inspired by God, but being special literature doesn't not make it literature.
Right.
And we
Right.
still need to engage it as such.
Yeah, and like, just to dissect a little bit what I mean when I say why would it be any other way. I know I've said this before on the podcast, but I'll repeat it quickly. Is that okay? If we're going to say that the Bible is God's message, God's story to us, God's story with humanity, that there's something for us as human beings in the pages of Scripture, and God is trying to communicate with us through that, then it has to condescend to us. It has to be communication in a sense that we could understand it.
Yeah.
And if it's going to tell stories, which is much of what it's doing, then it's going to tell stories in ways that we as human beings understand stories and tell stories. Otherwise, it would be unintelligible to us, and we would not understand it. So, yes, you can believe, and I believe, the Bible is very special. The Bible is unlike any other book in terms of its I guess I don't know what else to say. It is unlike any other book.
Well, it's unlike any other book in its, I think the best way to say it would be in its way of accurately describing reality, but not in the forensic, scientific, materialistic way.
Right.
It goes beyond that into the metaphysical. Now that's a big word, but what metaphysics is the ordering of reality that lies behind the material world, right? And so the Bible isn't primarily concerned with material causation. The Bible is primarily concerned with creating a people who live life in step with God's ordering of creation. That's the end. That's the telos. That's the goal of the Bible. And so when we belittle the Bible into forcing it into our philosophically materialistic categories, I think we do a disservice to it and damage to ourselves.
Yeah, and this might be a crude analogy, but one that just came to my head was the Bible isn't a woman telling the detective about the man that stole her purse. It's not a forensic description of the events that led up to the robbery.
Yeah.
The Bible is more like the father who tells his children bedtime stories.
Yeah.
Because while the forensic description describes events and characteristics, the bedtime story goes beyond mere description of events, but tries to elucidate a pattern through which the child can then see the world.
Yeah.
And this is why Peugeot will talk about fairy tales as tuning forks. This is why he thinks us moralizing the fairy tale is a bad route to go, because he sees them as describing reality. And, I mean, again, if a story isn't describing something that's real, you lose interest in it very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And we were just, well, I'll be pedantic. We were watching the new Batman Caped Crusader series, and we commented that, it's set in the art style of Batman the Animated Series, so it's Art Deco. It's like 1940s, 1950s cars and clothes, and that's how the characters are shaped, how the world is formed. And then you have a character who says, "Oh man, I'm cooked. Like they're
Using
using modern slang.
Contemporary slang.
And so the juxtaposition between the world that you see and the words that come out of people's mouths doesn't match, and so it feels off. It's not. It's not. There's elements of the thing that aren't true to the reality that it's attempting to display,
Yeah.
and so that makes you wince and cringe and go, that breaks the spell the thing is putting on you.
Yeah.
And
In a bad way.
in a bad way. And so with this whole way of seeing and reading the Bible like good literature, like Heiser says, the author is doing things on purpose. They're trying to cast a spell at some level.
Yeah.
And get you, and they're guiding you. They're taking you through this path. And that path happens to be probably the most true of the things that govern reality.
And I want to make another point quickly before we transition to ways of being. Stories are how we see the world.
Yeah.
You can't see the world without a story. And so it is crucially important that we as Christians see the world with the right story.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why I think both you and I push really hard against this materialistic view of the Bible. It's because it inhibits your ability to let the Bible's perspective become your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you're trying to do instead is make the contemporary perspective the Bible's perspective.
Right.
And so when we become insistent, when we act very insistently that the Bible is supposed to transform our way of seeing because narrative is the way we see the world, it's for that purpose.
Yeah, and I can prove that you see the world, or people see the world through a story maybe more powerfully in a negative sense. So many couples who are married and have children tend to not know what to do with themselves when the children leave the house.
Mm-hmm.
Because the story they have lived, the role they have played, the character they are, is parent much of the time.
Yeah.
That is the major thing that happens. And then when that is no longer preeminent in their day-to-day life, it is no longer part of their liturgical routine, they don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah.
Because they don't know the story they live in anymore.
Well, and that perfectly blends ways of seeing and ways of being. So I'm glad you brought that up because
It's so I just want to run the gamut, give a couple more. It's the same thing. It's part of what I've experienced recently of like, I'm no longer a student. And I've said recently to people, like, I still live in Springfield, but it's weird because I've only ever lived in Springfield to go to school. That's the only ever reason I've moved there twice, is to be a student. Now I'm not a student in a city where all I ever knew myself was as a student. And so the city's different to me. My role as a person in Springfield, as weird as that sounds, as inconsequential in the whole to Springfield as I am at the moment, I still don't know exactly what I'm up to because I don't know my role.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing on an awkward first date. It's the same thing on when you meet a new friend for the first time. It's the same thing that happens when you first have a child.
Mm-hmm.
We can go on and list so many things. The same thing when you start a new job. Where am I? How do I position myself in this hierarchy? What's my role? What story am I trying to tell about myself at this workplace? Which even for me, that's changed in the last 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we live in stories, and we can live in multiple stories at the same time. You can inhabit multiple roles, play multiple characters to different people, and if you're a well-integrated person, you're able to do that without actually changing who you are in any big way to everyone around you. But the point is that in all of these ways and all of these examples, you live in a story. I live in a story. We live in stories. And one of the main ways we can tell that that is the case is that when one of the main story threads that governs our lives collapses, you feel lost.
Or changes drastically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and so that was where I was going to go with this. So let's go back to the parents who they're now empty nesters. Not only has the narrative of their life changed, right? The role that they have played for 18 years is now changing drastically, or longer than that. But also the story that they participate in their life. So it's not just the way that they see, it's also the way that they are in the world, their being, right? And so the liturgy of their life changes. Now they don't have that other person in the house to, and so let's talk about liturgies a little bit. So we exist, I'm going to refer to this some in future episodes, but the author and contemporary philosopher James K.A. Smith talks about cultural liturgies, moments, things in our culture that are liturgically ordered that we all participate in. And he has a couple of examples. One example that I don't think he actually writes on, but something that I experienced in studying religion in undergrad. I went to a big university that's very popular for sports, and so one of our professors talked about how going to one of our sporting events is a religious function. We go through the same motions every time. We sing the same chants. We cheer, and we become anxious as the storyline plays itself out on the field. And, every game has its liturgy, especially if you're in the stands as a fan. There are cultural liturgies that you engage in there. There are call and responses, right? When third down happens on the field in a stadium, they ring the third down bell and all of the fans of the home team go crazy. And so all of these ritual actions communicate certain values, and as they do that, you participate in them. And that changes some aspect, small or large, of who you are. And assuming that it doesn't actually blinds you to the effect that it has on you and the values that you hold. And so one of the things that I think is super important for us as Christians to recognize is that our liturgically ordered worship, when it's not super theologically well formed, is actually a malformative practice, or can be. And I'll talk more about that at a later time. But liturgy is a lived story. Mm. And so not only do we see the world in a story, we behave in the world in line with a story, the story that we see. And so these things are intimately connected, and breaking them apart and separating them does damage to the way we're actually able to participate in and see the world around us.
Yeah, you can't tell me there's much difference between the third down bell, the call and response, the standing for the seventh inning stretch, and when at least in the Orthodox liturgy, when the Gospels are brought out from behind, from the altar, and the priest says, the gospel, he'll chant the Gospel according to St. John the Theologian, open it up, and then say, "Let us attest." He will read, and then everybody sits for the sermon. It's the same thing, just in a different context.
Mm-hmm.
And this liturgy, or you could, if you don't want to use a specifically religious term in our culture, you could talk about ritual.
Yeah.
Ritual is a way beat. And this is something Jonathan Peugeot points out all the time that I think is so fabulous. This is what really got me to like lean in to much of what he said. He's like, if you don't think you live ritualistically, just try and break the ritual. Talk to the back of someone's head. Sit down when you're supposed to stand up. Lay on the floor when you meet somebody new. Just try it and see what happens. Mm-hmm. See if you don't get beat up.
Yeah,
because
and a lot of, I mean, at a minimum, you'd be viewed as in some way, shape, or form socially awkward, right? I mean, that's what that is what having socially awkward faux pas is falling again. That's what that means, right? Is that you don't understand or participate in the culturally assumed liturgy the way that you're supposed to,
mm-hmm.
right? And so, we all exist in this way. The question is, can we make it explicit and be purposeful about the ways that we exist in this way? Or are we going to accidentally, arbitrarily let the culture around us set that ritualistic agenda? And I think that really is the problem, or one of the big problems with the church right now, is that I think the church has let the culture determine their liturgy, not the other way around. And that is not a good thing. So,
I'm just going to hold it now.
Fair. And the next thing that I wanted to say is that, well, you already kind of made this point, but like liturgy has a particular form that it takes, both in culture and in the church. It has a particular function that it observes, and it follows a certain pattern that's consistent. And so learning these things and walking in step with them in a way that's informed theologically by Christian principles, I think is super important. And then, I mean, we also have to recognize that, we all do have a liturgy, but we also are submitting to something in operating that way. And so the question becomes, what is it that you're submitting to? And if you're not explicitly aware of it, might it not be a good thing to submit to?
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was talking a little bit about the liturgy at church, and some comment was made about, well, at some level, I'm doing what I'm told, or I'm following the instruction. And this had come after he had been talking about, wanting to be really helpful for those he worked with, wanting to be a team player for his bosses, how hard his manager worked, da-da-da-da-da. And then we talk in the context of church, and he goes, well, I'm just not very good with authority. And later, as I was driving home with a buddy of mine, from that dinner, I looked at my friend and I said, yeah, so, so-and-so said that they were bad with authority, but apparently not at work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's, to your point, it's just, it's interesting to me to see who and in what places people are willing to submit to things and not in others.
Yeah.
And it's a great question to ask yourself if you are that kind of person, because I know many of them, and I was very much this way. It's like, I'm willing to submit and be a good worker at my job because I want to be helpful and useful and a team player, and all of those things. But then it comes to church and you're like, but I don't really trust my pastor.
Or I disagree with them on this theological point, and so I've got to be in some way openly and actively combative about it.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah. So just ask yourself, if I'm very happy and willing to submit to authority at work, but have a hard time submitting to authority in church, that might be worth thinking about.
Yeah. Well, and then the last thing that I wanted to mention about liturgy in general is that there are a couple of things that I think are important when it comes to thinking about the kind of liturgy that you as a Christian should be participating in. And I think it should be something that is very well theologically informed. And that likely means that it has some precedence within historic Christian practice and has been around for a little while and is very purposefully ordered in the way that it operates. That doesn't mean that it has to necessarily be high church. Now, high church tends to tick most of those boxes. I say as someone who's recently made the transition from a relatively low church context to a relatively high church context, not super high church, but
and I went from what would have been probably the lowest of low church to the highest of high church.
Yes.
So,
but I'm not going to argue for high church. I do want to argue for theologically, intentionally ordered liturgical practice. So, as an example, your typical low church service, I think, represents much more of a theater-style ordering where you come, you are spoken to, you are sung to, you are entertained, and then you leave. And I think that doesn't invite much participation, and participation is how we transform our being. But then in addition to that, it also trains us. It doesn't just not train us well, it trains us poorly because it's training us to be consumers. It's training us to be people who get it their way, even within religious spaces. And so, even when your way is not God's way, right? That's the important part. And so, a service that is theologically ordered, that demands of you that you stand, you bow, you sit, you kneel, you pray, you recite, you sing, you chant, you walk up to the front to receive communion, you do physical things. I do think that's important, but again, that's more high church. Although I have been in low church services that also do that. These kinds of things help transform you. And when they're ordered towards a good theological purpose, they help you become the kind of person in whom the law is naturally fulfilled, as opposed to doing the opposite. So that's all that I have to say about both ways of seeing and ways of being. Luke, do you have anything that you want to add and bring us home?
I'll just share a quick anecdote about how liturgy, this way of being, has caused my way of seeing to become different. And this might hit on what you were just talking about, something that's well theologically informed. So, as I described earlier in the Orthodox service, about halfway through, the gospel is read. And the gospel is brought out from behind the iconostas that's on the altar. The podium is usually rolled out. At least in my church, that's how it works. In some churches, I would bet there's a set podium, but maybe not. And the Gospels are placed on there, opened up, and then read. After the priest has said, like I described earlier, the Holy Gospel according to whoever the author is.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm slightly wrong. He says, let us hear from the Holy Gospel according to whoever it is. And then he will say, let us attest and read. And then typically, at least how my priest will phrase it, is as he begins his homily, he'll say, the gospel, what the gospel says to us today is X. Or how St. John tells this story in his gospel and gives this image, this picture. This is one way to understand it is this way here, so we can apply it to our lives. Usually it's pretty short. Usually it's very direct and very simple. But just the way in which the word gospel is used in the liturgy. Let us hear from the Holy Gospel. The gospel according to St. John or St. Mark or whoever. And then what this gospel story tells us, or the gospel reading from today, or the church has us read this gospel at this time because of this thing. I now, because I've heard it used in a different context so frequently, I now hear the gospel. And my first question is, which one?
Mm-hmm.
According to who? Which story? Because as we've talked about throughout the series we've been doing, the gospel is good news. The gospel is a story. The gospel is about who is reigning, who's ruling. It's not just the 3 to 5 act structure of Christ, his incarnation, his life, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. Although the gospel is definitely contained in all of those elements, the gospel is not merely reducible to those beats of the story. But when many evangelicals will talk about the gospel, those 4 or 5 beats is what they mean. But when you're in a church that constantly says, let us hear the Holy Gospel, the gospel reading of today, the church has us read the gospel, this gospel story, because it coincides with the calendar at this thing, it reveals to us this truth, it reminds us of this way of being. It transforms how I see because of the liturgy, because of the things that are said every Sunday I'm at church.
Yeah. It's no longer, as we get into how God became king, right? It's no longer this diluted form, this theologically abstracted form of the gospel. It becomes something that's both exists as a set of principles, but is also concrete in the way that the story lays itself out practically. And you're able to see it that way because of what the liturgy does to you, because of your consistent engagement within it. Oh, that's good.
All right, let's leave it there.